This is a Republic, if you can keep it, with Mark Brewer and Jeff Timmer.
I'm Mark Brewer. Welcome to an extraordinarily brilliant person episode of Republic, if you can keep it. Donald Trump, possessor of the self-proclaimed big brain, seems to have fully embraced a bunker mentality. His ever-shifting Iran strategy manages neither to sway Tehran nor study the global economy, but it does keep everyone guessing. Meanwhile, he's tied up in court trying to build an actual bunker, allegedly tucked beneath his $400 million gold-plated ballroom, because nothing says strong leadership like preparing to retreat in style underground.
I'm Jeff Timmer. The battle lines are drawn in Michigan for the November elections as candidates near and far file their petitions or filing fees in most cases. And the state's Democrats give preliminary approval to their candidates for most statewide offices. Later in the podcast, we'll have a conversation with the Dems' choice for Attorney General, Washtenaw County prosecuting attorney Eli Savit.
Michigan Democrats attracted a record-setting 7,200-plus delegates to their endorsement convention last weekend, along with potential presidential candidates Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, and Andy Beshear, as well as home field potential candidates Alyssa Slotkin and Gretchen Whitmer.
Trump's polling numbers continue to plummet. The latest AP poll has his approval rating a massive 40 points underwater, with only 30% approval, 70% disapproval. 70%. Even Fox News has Trump at 33% approval. Folks, I mean, even chlamydia is at 34%.
And the worst cabinet in generations is getting a huge shakeup with the firing of three of the most incompetent members, all of them women. Who's next? So many bozos from which to choose. Bottoms up Pete Hegseth, party animal Kash Patel, director of national ignorance Tulsi Gabbard, Epstein luncheon guest Howard Lutnick, brainworm Bobby Kennedy. Just so many choices and so little time.
Virginia voters gave their solid approval to a congressional gerrymander that should flip 4 seats to the benefit of Democrats, while Florida now struggles to enact what could be the final chapter of the Trump-initiated and Trump-led gerrymandering quagmire the Republicans now find themselves in. When it's all said and done, the GOP plan to reinforce its U.S. House majority is very, very likely to blow up in their face.
Back here in Michigan, our top election officials and executive branch officials agree. The latest Trump-branded election conspiracy tour deserves a hard pass. This comes in reaction to federal officials demanding full access to Wayne County's 2024 ballots.
Well, there's always a direct line between these attacks, these efforts to continually, without any evidence at all, sow seeds of doubt about the integrity of our elections, and then attack and threaten the election officials, the professionals who are charged with simply ensuring that every valid vote is counted and are accurate, and our election results are accurate and they are secured. That often, unfortunately, means not just against me, but our Detroit city clerk as well.
Treating election records like a clearance rack for future grievances. The whole exercise is doubling as a rehearsal for the Republicans' next claim that the 2024 election was rigged, a storyline notably unsupported by facts but eagerly worshipped by two-time election loser John James, who is still auditioning his 2020 script, blaming Secretary of State Benson, a plotline first piloted by Mike Rogers and apparently too good or too baseless to retire.
And the GOP field for governor in Michigan is down by 1, strangely, after filing the petition signatures earlier this week. Former State House Speaker Tom Leonard, who was polling in single digits and had raised even less money than that, suddenly dropped out of the race 2 days after filing his petitions.
Well, Jeff, you were prescient on that. You long ago predicted that Leonard had no path, and you were right. Back here, the man who led Trump Airlines into bankruptcy is brokering a deal for the federal government to take partial ownership of the equally prestigious Spirit Airlines at a cost to the taxpayers of $500 million.
Democrats in Michigan and across the country are focusing on affordability and specifically on gas prices as they challenge Republicans running for re-election to Congress. One target in Michigan, Lansing area Congressman Tom Barrett, who used the price of gas to flip the mid-Michigan district in 2024.
I'm Tom Barrett. Gas in Michigan is $4 a gallon all over again. When I'm elected to Congress, we'll get gas under control so that this will be a lot more affordable for families like yours and families like mine.
Meanwhile, a new report from the Anderson Economic Group says the ongoing high price of gas is costing a typical family $100 a month.
Two former Michigan Democratic Party and Republican Party officials are teaming up to suggest eliminating candidate nominating conventions for top offices, arguing that the practice disenfranchises voters. The two are former Michigan Democratic Party Chair Lon Johnson and former Republican Executive Director Jason Rowe. Jeff, you and I have both held those positions in the past. Why don't we kick off our discussion today by talking about this possibility?
Yeah, I guess I've long sided with the concept of changing the way Michigan deals with these convention-nominated offices. I like the role that parties have historically played in candidate selection and providing a platform that that most of their candidates can be judged by. But when it comes to the electorate you get in a primary, which already skews toward the extremes of either party, you have these circumstances that have arisen. It's manifested itself more strongly and much more skewed in the Republican Party over the last nearly now 2 decades since the rise of the Tea Party. But we saw it a little bit this weekend at the Democratic Convention, kind of the 16 years later, looking back at that Tea Party convention in Michigan in 2010, the Democrats, I wouldn't say this is a lurch toward their own version of MAGA, but it's kind of the same forces, the same dynamics within the convention that I witnessed in the Republican Party back in 2010. A faction of the party that doesn't represent anywhere near a majority of voters has the ability to organize and punch way above their weight at a convention. Even that it skews the results and has the potential to skew the kind of candidates that are nominated that are much more to the extreme right or extreme left in some instances, rather compared to the general election population. It's kind of the same reason, that I've come full circle in my life on the whole concept of redistricting. When you have a preponderance of elections that are for the legislature, for instance, that are decided in primaries, you get a much different voting base that is selecting these people, and you get much more polarized facts within the legislature in Lansing. And I think we're seeing that same kind of dynamic with these conventions and the type of candidates that are nominated for Attorney General or Secretary of State. We certainly saw that in the Republican Party 4 years ago with Christina Caramo and Matt DePerno. Now, they made a very surprising, I think, choice to kind of steer back from that type of nominee that has zero chance and no qualifications on paper to candidates that have qualifications on paper, yet very little chance of winning this November as Republicans. The Democrats didn't do that with any of the big ticket races. Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist winning that 3-way race, I think that surprised people that he did it on the first ballot. I think it even surprised Garland's team that he did it on the first ballot. But none of those candidates, Susanna Shkreli or my good friend Barb Byram, they would have been solid mainstream Democratic candidates. And the same with Karen McDonald and Eli Savit. I was surprised at that race, but it was a resounding victory by Savit, who is seen probably as maybe politically a little more left of Karen McDonald, but mainstream. He's a major county prosecutor with a long record, a long history working in government as the city of Detroit attorney. Quality candidates there, quality candidates that the Democrats have endorsed for the judicial races, the university boards. You got a sketchy choice happening with the Democratic Party and certainly with the Republican Party. And I would say that I'll finish with this and I'll get your thoughts, but I would also like to see a change in addition to the Secretary of State and Attorney General candidates being nominated by primary voters. I would like to see university boards, those positions be appointed by governor, because voters they know zilch point shit about these candidates. All it is a function of the top of the ticket. Whichever candidate, whichever party is prevailing at the top of the ticket almost always prevails in those board races. That's my thoughts. I don't think we're going to see a change, because it would require some significant movement in the legislature agreement. People would have to see this as a big issue. I don't think either party sees this as a big issue that needs to be dealt with next term, when the Democrats likely have a trifecta again.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I think this is a complicated issue. First, I think this most recent push to switch to primaries is being driven by people who are unhappy with endorsement convention results. I mean, let's be clear about that. But I want to take people back. One of the reasons I came up with in the Democratic Party the endorsement convention was because our primaries were so late. And I think it was true of both parties, but we in the Democratic Party wanted to do something about it. By the time we got to nominating our statewide ticket down below the governor's race, it was almost Labor Day. And that was not enough time to win the election. So I, in 2010, came up with the idea of an endorsement convention. It's not a nomination, but it gave a strong signal about who those nominees were going to be. And I think it's worked. So it worked so well, the Republicans borrowed the idea. You can get rid of the endorsement conventions if we move up the primaries, which I support, and in which there is significant support for now. The clerks are under a lot of pressure now with voting starting much earlier, 45 days before an election, which is something that didn't exist until half a dozen years ago. So if we move the primaries up, the endorsement conventions will go away. There will be no need for them because the rationale for them will disappear. So that's point one. Point two, I understand, people's concerns about conventions of several thousand people, disenfranchising primary voters, et cetera. But the flip side of that is, if we turn the Secretary of State and Attorney General's races into primary elections, it's also going to expand the cost dramatically. I mean, those are going to start costing millions of dollars, and that will exclude candidates from being able to run, right? So, I mean, there's going to be wins and losses here, no matter which way you go. I completely understand the argument. Let's expand it. Let's let more voters participate in the process. But there's going to be a cost to that, which means we need campaign finance reform, among other things. And finally, and I think you're with me on this, but I've been a strong, unashamed advocate for political parties. Do we have some dysfunction now? Yes. But I don't think the answer is tossing out the parties or tossing out their role in the nominating process. I think a balance needs to be struck here. Political parties are an important part of this democracy, and we need them. We need them to be strong. We need them to have roles. And one of the things I've observed when I was party chair, and national party officials would tell me this, they said, Mark, you have these extraordinary state conventions, whereas they go to state conventions in other states and they're boring, nobody shows up. I said, yes, that's because at our conventions, we nominate people. That gives people a reason to come to the conventions. So I'd like to see some balance of all these considerations, Jeff. We need to continue to have party conventions. They serve an important function, not just of nominating, but people getting together and talking to each other, trying to work together face to face. There's no substitute for that. but balance these other considerations as well. So I'm looking forward to this upcoming debate on this topic, and I hope we can find the right balance.
Yes, I will. The one asterisk I would put on the university boards being appointed rather than elected, the fact that these candidates who have long been acquaintances and friends of mine, first in the Republican Party and now in the Democratic Party, it's really a good process for people to get great sports tickets that they wouldn't otherwise get. These attention convention attendees, is they get perks and whatnot from these candidates. Being facetious here, we've spent a couple of episodes in the last 2 months talking about the way politics are impacting our education and our universities here in Michigan and across the country. And I think making them appointed by the governor rather than nominated at political conventions will help depoliticize some of the university governance. It's not going to take away the issues that universities are dealing with, but it will take away some of the heat that those responsible for the governance have to face.
Yeah, Jeff, I think that could be true, but then I look at what Ron DeSantis did in Florida. I mean, he has complete control over the education systems in those states because of gubernatorial appointment. Now, I will be the first to admit the political parties, both of them, could do a better job of the quality of candidates we sometimes nominate for these boards. And the parties don't escape criticism here either. By and large, I think our three research universities have been very well run. Obviously, there have been exceptions in terms of some of the people who get elected to these boards. But again, gubernatorial appointment has its risks, as we've seen in Florida. So hopefully there, maybe we can work out something. Maybe it's a mix of gubernatorial appointment and popular election. But yeah, I just don't think it's as simple as switching to gubernatorial appointment. That has risks too.
More on a republic, if you can keep it, after these messages.
When most of us think about polling, the focus is on those campaign polls telling us which candidates are winning. But the most important polls are for businesses, local governments, and nonprofits assessing the needs and wants of their customers or constituencies.
Those are polls that guide policies and lead to institutional success. Those polls have to get it right, which makes the choice of a public opinion research firm critical. Epic MRA has been trusted for more than 4 decades to get it right. Our clients have included school boards, statewide nonprofits, corporations, as well as the candidates and news media who rely on us during political campaigns. Whether it's just a couple of questions or a full in-depth survey, we're here and ready to help.
You can reach us at epicmra.com.
Are you looking to stay ahead of the curve on Michigan's public policy landscape? Look no further than Michigan Information and Research Service Incorporated, or MERS. MERS is your go-to source for comprehensive, nonpartisan news and analysis on Michigan's government and public policy. But that's not all. A MERS subscription also gives you access to our powerful legislative monitoring and tracking tools. Stay on top of every bill, amendment, and vote with real-time updates, detailed reports, interactive committee transcripts, legislative analysis tools, and more. Whether you're a policymaker, lobbyist, or just a concerned citizen, MERS keeps you informed with daily updates, exclusive interviews, and detailed reports. Subscribe today and gain access to our extensive archives. Stay informed, stay engaged, and stay ahead with MERS. Visit MERS.news to learn more and subscribe. That's MIRS.news. Don't miss out on the insights that matter most.
Earlier this week, Walt Sorg and I had the chance to talk with the Democrats' endorsed choice to succeed Dana Nessel as Attorney General, Eli Savit. A native of Ann Arbor, he attended Kalamazoo College in Western Michigan, where he played 4 years of college basketball. Following college graduation, Eli worked as a public school teacher, teaching both special education and general education 8th grade U.S. history. After graduating from the University of Michigan Law School, Eli worked for 2 federal judges. He was then selected to clerk on the United States Supreme Court for both Justices Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
That is a really interesting bipartisan pedigree for Mr. Savit there on the Supreme Court clerking. Prior to his election as Washtenaw County prosecutor in 2020, he served as senior legal counsel for the city of Detroit. As prosecutor, Eli has established dedicated special victims and domestic violence units, led the successful investigation and prosecution of multiple cold case rape cases, launched multiple successful programs that allow people dealing with behavioral health and substance use issues to obtain rehabilitative services while avoiding a criminal conviction, and established Washtenaw County's first ever Conviction, Integrity, and Expungement Unit, which remedies wrongful convictions and provides legally eligible residents free assistance in clearing old criminal records.
Eli Savit, congratulations on your, near nomination. Actually, you just endorsed at this point. The nomination has to wait until August. I want to start with a kind of an off-the-wall question about the whole process, and that is the call by a bipartisan group of former party leaders that the system be changed, that it's no longer done by convention, but rather by a primary election, which is where it's done in most states. What are your thoughts on convention versus primary?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, just having won a convention, you might think that I'd be in favor of a convention, but actually I do favor moving to a primary system. I just think is much more democratic with a lowercase d. I mean, especially if we're going to be doing voting in person. Look, it is a huge burden on a number of people to be able to come out and spend their entire Sunday just to make choices as to who's going to be on the ballot in November. If you're working class, you've got a shift that day, you can't make it. If you live in the Upper Peninsula, 13 hours away, it's really difficult for you to make it. I had people that, were supporters of mine in Sheboygan, and they were right in the line of the potentially burst dam, and so they couldn't make it down because of a natural disaster. And it doesn't make sense to disenfranchise people because they live far away, because they've got to work, because they're sick, because it's their kid's wedding that day, or because of an act of God. So I actually do favor moving to a primary process. I think it's more democratic, and we're lowercase d Democrats before we're capital D Democrats.
And now that we're all agreed on democracy, Mark, why don't we get into the issues? You want to kick it off?
Sure, thanks. Well, again, let me add my congratulations, Ellie, to your endorsement. That's terrific. Yeah, but let's look forward now. We have an endorsed candidate for Attorney General on the Republican side. We Democrats now have you. Tell us about your vision for what the Attorney General can and should do for the people of Michigan. What would you do when you're elected?
Michigan really, in a lot of ways, set the bar for what an attorney general's office should be with the Attorney General, the late Frank Kelly. He started the first consumer protection division in the attorney general's office, in any attorney general's office, in fact, nationwide. Started the first environmental protection unit in an attorney general's office nationwide. And fundamentally, the attorney general is the lawyer in the state that represents the people of the entire state. And for me, that means standing up for the people against especially the most powerful of interests, right? Whether that is a corporation that's price gouging you, right? And maybe in the future using AI to do it, whether it's your boss who's stealing from you, whether it's a corporate polluter who's contaminating our air and our water, or frankly, whether it's the president of the United States, and I say this really meaning it, no matter which party the president is from, that is taking resources away from the state of Michigan, that is, threatening our right to vote in the state of Michigan, that is threatening civil rights in the state of Michigan. All of those are situations where the attorney general needs to step in on behalf of the people, because in a lot of those cases, people may not be able to stand up for themselves. If you think about it, if there's a powerful corporation on the other side, let's say you're a low-income tenant, right? You may not be able to find a lawyer to go into court against your landlord, even if they're violating consumer protection laws, right? You may have signed away all your rights, actually, by clicking terms and conditions boxes when you signed up for a good or service. So there's a whole host of scenarios where it's not just a good thing for the attorney general to be involved in a case. it really is the only way that people can secure justice. And that's what I hope to do as Attorney General.
Well, why don't we, if we could, why don't we go through some of these in terms of specifics? I mean, for example, as you know, there's a lot of concern these days about the high cost of utilities, right? Gas, electricity. We just get rate increase after rate increase requested from the PSC. What would you do? How would you handle the rising cost of utilities in this state as Attorney General?
Yeah, look, and I think our current Attorney General, Dana Nessel, has done a great job of this, just as Frank Kelly did before her. The Attorney General has the authority to intervene in the Public Service Commission on behalf of ratepayers in the state of Michigan and challenge proposed rate hikes. And some of the stuff that has come out of the utilities in recent years is just egregious, right? I mean, they're seeking to foist onto ratepayers costs of, for example, private jet travel and, trips to lobby government officials. And cost of living is too high right now anyway. And when you layer onto that these ever rising, steeply rising rate increases, it is really harming people. This is one of the number one things that I hear concern about as I'm traveling the state. So absolutely, I will be intervening in those ratepayer cases whenever the evidence dictates that a rate hike is unreasonable. And, I want to say this too. A lot of this, we've got to be honest about this. A lot of this harkens back to money in politics, because DTE consumers, they are regulated monopolies. They are regulated by the state government. And far too frequently, they give huge checks to politicians, campaign apparatus, and then they expect favors in return. I want to be clear about this. No company is giving money to politicians out of the goodness of their heart, right? They are doing it because they want something in return, which is why I'm proud to have taken the League of Conservation Voters Pledge to not accept any utility money, because my loyalty is always going to be to the people of the state of Michigan and not the corporations that are funding me.
On another issue that you mentioned was artificial intelligence. There's a lot of concern out there in a variety of ways, that these data centers are going to consume a lot of energy, consume a lot of water, but also they may displace workers, right? Their algorithms may be inherently discriminatory. What would your approach be to dealing with artificial intelligence in many ways affecting us as a society?
Yeah. So one of the things that I will say at the outset here is we are years behind where we need to be in terms of AI regulation. The time to really think carefully and deeply about regulating AI was frankly 5 or 6 years ago, when we saw these first chatbot models. And I say this because we have seen allegedly, I will say allegedly, but people literally lose their lives as a result of unchecked, unregulated artificial intelligence. There's an article in the New York Times just a couple days ago about a case in Florida that is being investigated criminally because ChatGPT, again allegedly, encouraged a young person to kill themselves. So this really is life or death in a lot of ways. And look, I think that we need comprehensive AI regulation like yesterday, and some of that is going to take legislative action. Here's the great thing about the Attorney General's powers in this space, though. Especially for consumer issues, the Attorney General actually has rulemaking authority under the Michigan Consumer Protection Act, which means that the Attorney General doesn't need to wait for a legislative update specifically addressing the dangers of AI in the consumer sphere. As long as it arguably violates an existing provision of the Consumer Protection Act, the Attorney General can issue rules which make certain conduct unlawful. And what I have pledged is that during my first 100 days in office, I am going to do that. And I'll just give you one example of this. We are seeing a huge rise in surveillance pricing, individualized pricing, personalized pricing, whatever you want to call it, in which different people are being charged different amounts for the same goods and services based on an AI algorithm that has all of their personal data. And I want to just give an example of this, right? In the airline industry, for example, we are all familiar with the concept of bereavement fares, right? But now with surveillance pricing, which is geared towards making you pay your absolute maximum pain point for a good or service, we could see precisely the opposite. Because these companies have all of this data, they have this algorithm. And if my dad dies in Boston, I mean, my dad's from Michigan, but like if one's dad dies in Boston, right, and you're living here in Michigan, and you need to find a flight home for that funeral, the AI algorithm is very likely going to know that you recently lost a loved one. You recently lost your father. And that means they're going to know that to get back to Boston, you'll pay just about anything. So a $300 ticket could cost you $2,000 because your price point there is virtually infinite. Now, I mentioned this example because I think this is going to be very easy actually to defend in court. I'm going to issue a rule that says this kind of surveillance, personalized pricing using AI algorithms is unlawful under our existing price gouging provision in the Michigan Consumer Protection Act. And I'm confident that I'm right about that. Because if in the 1970s, when the Michigan Consumer Protection Act was passed, you went to the members of the legislature and you said, well, what if you went up to the ticket counter and you said, I need a flight to Boston? And they said, great, $300. And they said, that's wonderful. My dad just died. I really need to get home. And they said, oh, for you, $2,000. Is that price gouging? Every member of the legislature would say, of course, that's a definition of price gouging. Right. Why should it be any different because an AI algorithm is doing it? I don't think it is. And so we're not just on that front, but on a whole host of fronts, we're going to be issuing a comprehensive suite of rules within our first 100 days in office.
A corollary of that whole situation with AI is the facilities to support AI, the data centers across the state. And Michigan, like virtually every other state, has become a NIMBY state. People don't want these things. What is going to be your posture towards them? I know Attorney General Nessel has been very active in fighting some of these data centers, and in fact, fighting one specifically in your backyard.
Yeah. So look, if we're going to build these things, and I don't think the Attorney General has the authority to stop them altogether, but if we're going to be building these things, they need to meet just several central conditions. Number one, should be obvious, be built using union labor, right? Number two, they should not ever increase rates on ratepayers. These are being financed by multi-billion dollar corporations. They can pay for their own electricity, and it should never increase the costs on the rest of us. Number three, they should not be depleting our natural resources. I mean, we're worried about our groundwater. We're worried about our drinking water. If they're using closed loop water systems, they're, not depleting our natural resources. That's better, right? But we need to keep our natural resources ours for future generations. And the fourth thing that I'll say is that we need some transparency in this process. I think that one of the things that has been frustrating to AG Nessel, as well as to folks who are concerned about data centers, is a lot of these projects make really good sounding promises, right? They say it's going to be cooled using closed loop water systems. They say it's going to be built using union labor. They say that it's not going to increase rates on ratepayers, but in fact may decrease rates on ratepayers. But then when it comes time to show you the goods, right, show you exactly how they're going to do this and what accountability is going to look like, they provide redacted documents. They don't provide the relevant information. So we need some transparency in this process as well.
I want to turn to a different topic, another important one that you touched on in your opening remarks. I think you're doing this in your office now. You are actively enforcing the labor laws to the extent you can as a local prosecutor.
Yep.
Making sure workers are not exploited, being misclassified. So tell us about what you have been doing as a prosecutor, and what you can do as Attorney General to protect people from being exploited as employees.
Yeah, so let's start with this basic fact, which if I accomplished nothing else during this campaign, I think I got the word out about this. Wage theft is the most common form of theft in the United States. That's bosses stealing from their workers. And in fact, if you added up every other form of theft in the United States, every robbery, every pickpocket, every time somebody rifled through your car and stole stuff, you add the value that Americans lose due to all that up, the amount that Americans lose each year due to wage theft exceeds all of that combined.
And if I can interrupt you there, tell our listeners what you mean by wage theft. Is it denying people overtime? You mean, what is it?
There are so many ways, actually, that wage theft can occur, right? It can be denying people overtime. It can simply be paying them less than they're entitled to with their hourly wage. Another form of wage theft that frequently goes overlooked is misclassification, right? You're called an independent contractor when you are, in fact, an employee. Why is this wage theft? Well, it's because, among other reasons, at the end of the year, when you're paying your taxes, your employer is supposed to pay half of the share of your share of payroll taxes if you're an employee. If you're misclassified as an independent contractor, you're on the hook for the employer's share that you should have never been on the hook for. So that's a form of wage theft as well. Wage theft can also look like forcing somebody to pay for their uniform, right? If they're in the service industry, which is all too common. It can look like tip theft, which ranges from companies just straight up stealing the tips and the bosses taking the tips for themselves to the salaried managers that may be in the tip pool, which is not legal. Those are tips that are supposed to go to tipped workers. And if they're not getting their full share of that tip pool, then that's wage theft as well. So in Washtenaw County, we said, look, let's do something about this. And so we started the only worker and consumer protection unit, which is called the Economic Justice Unit, in a prosecutor's office in the entire state of Michigan. We're the only prosecutor's office that goes after this extremely common form of theft. And we've been successful. We've gotten money back in workers' pockets. We've stopped wage theft schemes. On the consumer side of things, we've stopped scams that are targeting our seniors, and we've stopped predatory out-of-state slumlords from maintaining homes in dilapidated conditions, advertising them as though they are pristine, and trapping families in conditions that are just dangerous for their health. So that's the work of an attorney general, I'll submit, right? It's to go after these bad actors when people may not be able to go after them themselves, right? Because if you're a worker and you're getting your paycheck stolen or part of your paycheck stolen by your boss, you may be afraid to bring a claim yourself because you're worried about retaliation at your workplace. This is your job. If you're a low-income family and you're living in slumlord conditions, you're worried about the roof over your head and retaliation by your landlord. And frankly, in all these cases, you may not be able to find a lawyer to take on your case because there may just not be enough money in it. That's the work of the attorney general. That's what it means to be the people's lawyer.
I was going to say the people's lawyer. What can the attorney general do about gas prices? I recall Attorney General Frank Kelly certainly jawboning, as we would say, threatening gas stations and oil companies who he thought were charging excessively. Is there something an attorney general can do to control gas prices?
I think so, but of course it's going to depend on the circumstances and why gas prices are going up. I mean, right now, gas prices are just sky high because we decided to undertake this idiotic war with Iran, which has had the effect of only killing people in the Middle East, killing American service members, and raising the price of gas here at home. So, there are actual economic forces that are at issue. Now, where I think the attorney general can play a role is when companies are taking advantage of a time of international conflict or a natural disaster or something like that, and jacking up the prices on gas at a time where people need it the most or at a time when there's already turmoil in the marketplace. Michigan's Consumer Protection Act has a price gouging provision. Now, what I will say, too, is we do need amendments to the Consumer Protection Act. I know State Senator Jeremy Moss has introduced one with the support of AG Nessel, which would specify thresholds beyond which you can't raise prices during a time of natural disaster or a time where people really need not just gas, but potentially hotel rooms after displacement by a storm, tree removal services, and the like. So I'm strongly supportive of that measure. But yeah, even as written, there are some things the attorney general can do if it meets the legal threshold for price gouging.
Let me ask you about one of the issues that will probably be carrying over into the new administration, and that's one that Attorney General Nessel's been fighting now for years, the Enbridge pipeline. She just won a big court case from the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously saying this is a state issue, not a federal issue. How are you going to proceed, assuming that is still in litigation?
Yeah, and the litigation is all over the place right now, right? And so I really can't commit to a particular litigation position because we've got a case that was just decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. We've got a case involving the tunnel that's in front of the Michigan Supreme Court. We've got the case that's sort of sitting out there in Ingham County, and we have really a disastrous decision, I think, from the district court in the Western District of Michigan, which I'll get into in just a second. But look, my North Star is this: protect the Straits of Mackinac, right? That is the worst place in the world, I think, for an exposed oil pipeline that is aging, because an anchor strike, a rupture, it could pollute 90% of the nation's fresh water supply because of where it's situated in the Straits of Mackinac. So that's my North Star. And I'll say my other North Star now is to get this disastrous decision from the Western District of Michigan off the books. And this was a decision which held essentially that the state of Michigan cannot do anything at all with respect to pipeline safety because it's preempted by federal law, that is exclusively within the federal government's power to address. That means that not only could we not do anything with respect to the dangers of Line 5 on the bed of the Straits of Mackinac, but we couldn't do anything anywhere else in the state either. And don't forget, Enbridge is responsible for the largest inland oil spill in American history in the Kalamazoo River, right? It is so broad that it prevents the state from having any say even in the routing of pipelines, which means that if a pipeline is going to go right next to a school, the state can't say, hey, we're concerned about a natural gas explosion in our kids' lives, right? They just have no say in that. It is a exceedingly broad decision, which I think is wrong, and it's something that we need to get off the books. And look, on the pipeline perspective, I realize that within our party, we've been having debates, between labor and environmental groups about how best to address the obvious dangers of Line 5, with, tunnel or no tunnel. And what I say to everybody is nobody should want this decision to remain on the books, because from a labor perspective, if you're saying the state can't do anything at all with respect to pipeline safety, that means they have no leverage to even force Enbridge to build a tunnel, right? Enbridge can just continue operating as they have been. It also means that we can't put into place basic safety standards, which means necessarily more maintenance and more jobs requiring maintenance to live up to those standards. So it's just a disastrous decision all the way around for the state of Michigan. And so that's my, I guess, secondary North Star. If you can have two North Stars, is get that one off the books.
It's a big universe.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm sorry, Ellie, we're throwing a lot at you here, but there's so much within the portfolio of the Attorney General. Voting rights, obviously, tremendous issue the last 10 years, frankly. We see ourselves constantly under assault here in Michigan. We pushed back, got a couple of great constitutional amendments, and we pushed back. You've been part of that pushback. So tell us your views on voting rights and what you've done in that area and what you'd like to do as Attorney General.
Well, Mark, you and I have gotten in some good trouble together, and I'm still on the email listserv with the election law lawyers that try to protect democracy here in Michigan. I've done voting rights cases. I've been a cooperating attorney for the ACLU in a couple of voting rights cases. Very proud to have done that. Every election cycle since 2016, I've been in the boiler room for the MDP, helped organize it some years, really doing on the ground election protection work across the state of Michigan. And for folks that don't know, on election day, there's a bunch of lawyers like Mark and I sitting in a windowless room in an undisclosed location, fielding calls from across the state about things like voters not being allowed to vote at this location. The lines are too long. This polling place isn't open. There's intimidation at the polls here, and trying to address those as quickly as possible. So here's
one area that's targeted by Republicans especially is something you should know a lot about. You are the prosecutor of a county that has two major universities, and they don't want students voting.
Exactly. The next Attorney General is going to be the Attorney General that is in place during the 2028 presidential election. And we have to expect, and I hope I'm wrong about that, but we have to expect that there are going to be attempts to disenfranchise students, minority communities, women, right? And we have to be prepared for anything that gets thrown at us by the federal government or otherwise. And what I've said is that the work on that starts not in 2028, but on January 2nd, 2027, which is my second day in office, because I think I'm probably going to be busy with ceremonial stuff during my first day in office. But starting then, we need to start planning for every way that the right to vote could be attacked in the state of Michigan. And that requires getting a lot of people around the table. It includes, of course, my office, Secretary of State's office, local clerks, local law enforcement, right? as well as voting rights organizations like the ACLU, NAACP, right? We need to have plans in place for every single eventuality, because the truth of the matter is we don't know what's coming in 2028, but we got a pretty good sense that something is coming. So what does it look like? It could look like ICE agents being stationed at polling places or around polling places to disenfranchise and disincentivize people from coming to vote. It can look like efforts to implement the SAVE Act, right? Whether through this citizen voting initiative that we have here in Michigan, whether it's through an act of Congress, whether it's through an executive order. It could look like threats to mail-in ballots. And of course, we have no reason to absentee voting in Michigan now. It can look like intimidation, not just at the polls on election day, but we don't really have an election day anymore. We have an election period. And are there ICE agents? Are there, simply unaffiliated Proud Boys or what have you? They're showing up to early voting sites. Here's what I don't want to have happen. I am not going to spend precious hours even researching or writing complaints or briefs or pleadings when something happens. My goal in these tabletop exercises is to have a plan for every eventuality that anybody can think of, right? Even ones we think are far-fetched. And then to have lines of communication established, and from the AG's perspective, to have a stack of complaints in case we need to go into court and seek to get an injunction halting a particular threat to the right to vote whenever it comes up, whether it comes up in 2028 or even before.
We've had a great discussion here, Ellie. There's a lot of stuff we need to talk about. But before we let you go, I want to talk about one more topic, if you'll bear with me. The voters here overwhelmingly adopted a reproductive choice amendment protecting the right to reproductive choice in 2022. But we still see threats to that. We have other states that want to extradite or, our providers because they may have done something by telephone, for example. We see threats of, funding cutoffs, gag rules, and so forth for the federal government. Where are you on the issue of choice, and what can the Attorney General do to continue to protect that right?
Yeah, so I think I've got a pretty good track record on choice. I was really proud to litigate, and I personally litigated this case alongside Governor Whitmer in 2022 when Roe versus Wade was overturned because Michigan had an 1846 criminal abortion ban that threatened to spring back into effect. And as a result of that litigation, which we sided with the governor in, again, I personally litigated it, we were able to get that struck down by a state court, preserving reproductive freedom in Michigan until the voters could enact Proposal 3. But as you note, the threat to reproductive freedom isn't over, and I've been proud to join coalitions of cities and counties across the nation in challenging things like efforts to deny access to mifepristone, which is medication abortion. I led, actually, a coalition of police and prosecutors in the United States Supreme Court filing a brief in the EMTALA case, which was a case that sought to preserve nationwide access to emergency room abortion. So since 2021, I believe we've filed or joined 16 briefs as county prosecutor seeking to preserve reproductive freedom. And I'm going to continue fighting for reproductive freedom at every step of the way as Attorney General. And there are a number of threats. I mentioned mifepristone, right? That's certainly a threat. We've got RFK threatening to, reconsider whether mifepristone is safe. And we've got, of course, private litigants that have been challenging it. I'm also very concerned that at some point, and this was in Project 2025, which provided the playbook for this administration, that they're going to seek to re-invoke the Comstock Act, which would prohibit the shipment, essentially, of not just medication abortion, though that's the most immediate threat, but read broadly enough, it could prohibit the interstate shipment of even surgical tools that can be used for procedural abortions, which would basically mean that even in states where it's legal and constitutionally protected, like Michigan, there's functionally no access. We're seeing funding cuts to Planned Parenthood. And all of this is stuff that the Attorney General, I think, needs to be on the front lines of fighting back against in court, not just because we have a reproductive freedom amendment, but because this is something that impacts the health of so many Michiganders as well as their lives. I'll just end with this. My grandmother, she was a Republican actually for most of her life, although she switched parties after Trump.
Makes Thanksgiving a little easier.
Exactly. But she was a nurse. And she passed away at the age of 97 in 2022. And I went to visit her right after Roe fell, and I was working on a lot of these cases. And I'll never forget, she just had this heartbroken look on her face. And she said, Ellie, we decided this. I watched young women die because abortion wasn't available to them and because they did back alley abortions in unsafe ways. She said, I watched women die. This was decided, and now the Supreme Court has taken it away, and people are going to die. And I'll be damned if, as Attorney General, I'm not standing up at every single attempt to undermine the right to reproductive freedom, because it is literally life or death.
Thanks for that, Ellie. Before we let you go, how can our listeners and others get involved in your campaign? How can they make a donation? How can they volunteer? How can people reach your campaign?
Yep. So our website is ellieformichigan.com. And for those of you who haven't seen my name spelled yet, it's spelled like Eli. So it's ELIFOR Michigan.com. And look, we are gearing up for an incredibly consequential and tough general election fight here. We need resources. We're going to need volunteers. We're going to need folks to host house parties and fundraisers. If you can do any of that, now's the time. The earlier folks can get involved in this general election campaign, the better, because this is going to be an expensive race. It's going to be a race that's on an extremely crowded ballot in the state of Michigan, and we're going to be fighting for dollars and fighting for attention. But I'll just make this pitch. I don't think there's a more important position in the state than Attorney General right now, for all the reasons we've talked about. It's our voting rights. It's our reproductive freedom. It's who's going to address the looming threats of AI. It's whether our boss can steal from us and whether we can continue to enjoy clean drinking water and fresh air to breathe. That's what the Attorney General's race is about. So if you can hop on the website, make a donation, sign up to volunteer to vote, get in touch with our campaign, we'd be deeply appreciative. But more importantly, it's something that's going to be really, really impactful for the future of the state of Michigan.
Let me wrap it up with a quick story from my past. Frank Kelly was one of my good friends, served as Attorney General for 37 years, national record. I asked him once, why didn't you run for governor? You would have won easily. And his answer was quite succinct. He says, because I can get a whole lot more done as Attorney General.
Yeah. Agreed.
That's it. Well, Eli Savit, the Democratic Party's endorsed candidate for Attorney General, thank you for taking the time to go over all these issues and your views and your plans when you're our next Attorney General. Good luck to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
That's the latest from two of Donald Trump's favorite low IQ, soft on crime pundits. But I'm in good company with Jeff Timmer, I'll tell you. I'm just relieved that I got back from my vacation before Delta ran out of jet fuel or raised the cost to be returning.
I'm so low IQ, Merc, I don't even know what we're talking about right now. So I'm just relieved that I don't have any upcoming flights planned on Spirit Airlines, or I guess the new Trump airline. If the Republic is still standing, we'll return next week. And as always, thank you for your attention to this matter.
A Republic, if you can keep it, is a presentation of Michigan citizens for a better tomorrow.